Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Gretchen and today I am here with my first reading recap of 2025. So this has been kind of a crazy year so far in my life personally and in my reading life. So for those of you that aren't aware, I started a new job at the beginning of the month and that has taken a lot of time and energy and brain power for me to get through, but the one promise that I made to myself is that every single day I would set aside a dedicated chunk of time to make sure that I was reading. I didn't want my reading to fall behind. Reading is such a joy to me and I find it to be a huge stress reliever, and it's so good for my mental health, and I didn't want to let the overwhelming task of learning a new job get in the way. So I really am focusing on making sure that I'm still continuing to make reading a priority in my life as well. Now, because of that, I've actually been able to finish more books than I thought that I would be able to. So that is a really good thing for me. It's a really busy time as far as books go for me. We're in the throes of 2 book prizes. The Aspen Words Prize, that's something I talked about on my channel previously. I really wanted to read the entirety of the long list because each of those books sounded very interesting to me. Normally I would maybe just stick to the short list, but all of those books were ones that I really thought would be something that I would enjoy. So I really wanted to try to get through that. So that's something I've been working on. The other thing is we have had the announcement of the long list for this year's Republic of Consciousness Prize in the US and Canada, and there are 10 books on that list. Some of them are very short, some of them are quite long, but I did want to try to go through and read at least the ones that sounded interesting to me. That prize is different because it's kind of a short turnaround. You don't have much time to read everything before the short list is announced, and then the long list I think is announced in March. So, or I'm sorry, the winner is announced in March, I believe. So it's a prize that has 10 books on it, but it does have a very short turnaround time. So I'm not really putting a whole lot of pressure on myself to read the entirety of that long list prior to the winner announcement being made, but I have added all 10 of those books to my TBR, and hopefully they're 10 books that I can get to at some point in time throughout the duration of this year. And then lastly, I signed up to be a judge for the Booktube Prize. So they haven't announced the first round yet and who the judges will be, but I think because this would be the first year that I attempted to be a judge, I think the chances are pretty high that I'll get selected. So maybe within the next week or so, I will also be working on being a judge for the Booktube Prize as well. So I have a lot on my plate as far as reading goes, and that's exactly how I love my life to be. So without further ado, let's talk about those recent reads that I've had. The first book that I want to talk about is called A Great Country. This is by Shilpi Somaya Gowda, and this was published in 2024. Now, the reason that I read this book was because it's long listed for the Aspen Words Literary Prize, and it just sounded like a really interesting read, and it was, and I'm super glad that I read it. So this follows a family. They're Indian Americans, and they have finally got to the point where they feel like they have achieved the American dream. They came over from India, the mother and father did as a couple, and they basically scraped their way to the top. And the story starts with them in this fancy new neighborhood that they just moved into, and they're kind of enjoying life and living it up. And of course, as soon as you get to that point where you think things are all great, something tragic usually happens to tear you back down ground reality. And what happens is they get a call about their son, their young son, who I think is like 11 or 12. He gets arrested and he's taken into police custody, and basically the story starts to unfold from there. And the family quickly starts to realize that even though they have achieved what they think is that American dream, the color of their skin and their nationality is always going to be something that stands in their way from truly getting to the point where they want to get to. And this is a book that has a lot of really thought-provoking things that are happening throughout it. There's a lot of different side stories and narratives. So we're touching on not only, you know, immigration and race and social class, but we're talking about generational conflict between the parents and the children. There's also a side story about one of the daughters. You know, her skin is brown and she is dating this boy that is Mexican American, and he comes from a very poor family, and you know, Deepa obviously comes from a wealthier family that has really worked to get to that point. And there's conflict between her boyfriend and herself because he doesn't validate her feelings of feeling repressed because he aligns her to having privilege. And then there's this discussion about truly what is privilege. Is there a difference between inherent privilege, where you're just born into wealth and you get everything handed to you, or is there a difference between somebody working to get to the point of being considered privileged, and is there truly a difference between those two types of privilege? I thought this was a fantastic book. It had solid writing. It had great characters. The plot was propulsive. There were even a couple things in it that were a little kind of twisty, maybe you would call it twisty, but there were a couple reveals that were kind of like shocking. And yeah, I really enjoyed my time with this, and I would definitely recommend this book to you if you think any of that sounds interesting. The next book I finished is called Devil is Fine by John Vercher, and this was published in 2024. And this is another book that was longlisted, or is longlisted, I should say, for the Aspen Words Literary Prize. And this is a book that's kind of difficult to categorize. It's a bit speculative, it's a bit psychological, it's a bit historical, definitely literary. Now, this story follows our main character. He is a biracial man, and the story opens with us having him tell the story of him going to his son's funeral. So through the duration of the story, he is addressing his son and he is telling his son this story. Then we very quickly learn a couple chapters in that he has inherited this piece of land from the white side of his family. It was his great-grandfather, and he's really not interested in this land. He just wants to go and sell it and be done with it. So he travels to it, and when they're doing all of the preparation to get it ready for selling, they uncover some things and they quickly realize that this is actually a plantation that this land was a part of, or there was a plantation on this land that he now owns as a biracial man. So the rest of the story kind of follows them uncovering the things that led them to realize that this was a plantation, and then the story starts to unfold and tell us all about that history. But also it follows this man who is grappling with his identity and the fact that he is now the owner of a plantation, but also he's dealing with the grief of losing his son. And we learn about him and his son and the relationship that he had, and we learn about the traumas that he had as a young child himself and how he carried those traumas into his adulthood with his relationship with the mother of his son as well as his son, and it kind of gets into some really speculative elements. There's a lot of ghosts and there's a lot of just strange things happening, but it was such an engaging story. It was done so well. The writing I thought was fantastic. It was an original story that I haven't heard, but that level of speculation and almost magical realism to an extent really made this story shine for me. I loved the conversational tone throughout the book too, as if we were the son and he was telling us all of these feelings that he had. So it almost had that confessional element to it, and it was just a really interesting story. It was really beautiful at times. That father-son relationship really shined through, and yeah, I thought it was a solid book, and it's not one that I'm going to forget for a while. Like, it was a unique enough story to not only keep me interested, but it's one that I'm not gonna forget just because of how odd it was at times and some of the strange things that happened throughout. So yeah, I definitely recommend this book if any of that sounds interesting to you. I know some people have issues with, you know, magical realism or speculative elements, so just be aware that you'll have that going into this. But yeah, I really did enjoy my time with this. And the next book was a fun read for me. I read What I Ate in 1 Year by Stanley Tucci. This is a follow-up to his memoir Taste, which came out a few years ago. And this was basically a diary of what he ate over the course of the year, sprinkled with some memoir in there as well. So we had not only food, but we had travel. We talked a lot about his acting. We talked a lot about his interactions with his children and his wife, and this was a interesting read. It took us from these fancy Michelin-starred restaurants to these little dives in the middle of nowhere. We learned about all this food he was eating in those fancy restaurants, but also had talked about the simple foods that he would cook for his family in his own home. So it was a very food-heavy book, so any foodies out there would likely enjoy this book. He also provides recipes throughout the duration, so if he mentions something that he made, he'll often write out the recipe. So if it's something that you want to try, you're able to do so. And I just find his life to be very fascinating. I love him as an actor. He narrates the audiobook and I absolutely love his voice. And I think that honestly, it's the best way to consume this book if it's something that you're interested in reading. And I will also say that he is very aware that he lives a privileged life, and for all of that pretentiousness that sometimes seems to surface, you can tell that he is very humble and he worked very hard to get where he is. If you did read Taste, you know that he didn't come from wealth and he had to kind of work toward that privilege. And yeah, I love the way he talked about his family and his wife. This was not just about food, but it also had very heartfelt and poignant moments as he talked about his children growing up and even them losing kind of their innocence in a way, questioning whether or not Santa exists and how he handled those. There was just a lot of heart, and it was just a very enjoyable low stakes read. And yeah, I really enjoyed my time with it. I think I preferred Taste a little more than this, simply because it gave us more background on his upbringing and it was more memoir based, where like I said, this was definitely more food heavy. But yeah, if you at all enjoyed Taste, I think you're gonna like this one too. So the next book that I finished was called The Husbands by Holly Gramazio. This was published in 2024, and this was one of the books I meant to get to last year that I didn't, so this is one that I can check off my list. So this is a very interesting premise. It follows this woman that all of a sudden realizes that she has a husband and she had no idea. She doesn't think she has one, but there's this man in her house claiming to be her husband, and she has no idea what's going on, so she calls her family to confirm, and sure enough, they're telling her that she is married. And just as she's getting used to the idea of being married to this man, he goes up into the attic and a different husband comes down. So basically she just has this magic attic with a revolving supply of husbands for her to try out. And the book is just this quest for her to find that perfect husband, and it's causing her to look inward in her life to figure out what her needs are, what her wants are, what she's looking for in that perfect spouse, and we're on that journey with her to find it. And I thought that it was a really fun premise, and I was really engaged for most of the book, and then we started to get to the point where it just seemed really gimmicky, and she went from being a character that I was cheering on and rooting for to one that I found to be very annoying and frustrating, because she started to dismiss these husbands for stupid reasons, and she was really just on that quest to find the perfect man. And we all know that a perfect partner is non-existent, and you're gonna have flaws no matter what. And then of course she has regrets about husbands that she let go, and it just became kind of tedious toward the end. And I think that also the author just gave us and cycled through so many husbands. I think as a reader, we got what the author was trying to do, and she could have done it with a handful of different husbands, but instead we were going through them like water, and it just seemed to be a little much toward the end, and it just got to the point where sometimes it was ridiculous. But I will say, for all of that, I thought the writing was good. It was a debut, and I found myself to be incredibly satisfied with the ending. And I was really worried about that as I started to get frustrated with this character toward the end. And as I was getting close to the end, I thought in my mind, I'm going to hate the ending of this book, but I was actually very pleasantly surprised. So it ended up making me enjoy the book all the more. So if any of you out there kind of like those gimmicky stories and this sounds at all interesting, I would give it a go. Like I said, there were times when it was a little bit of a slog for me, but the ending redeemed itself, and I definitely think this is a memorable read. I haven't read anything like this before, and it's a plot that if somebody mentioned that book to me again, I'd be like, oh yeah, that's the one with the magic attic and all the husbands coming out. So I think it was memorable enough, and it was just a solid, enjoyable read. The next book that I finished was called Madwoman by Chelsea Bieker, and this is published in 2024. And surprise, surprise, this is another book off of the Aspen Words Literary Prize long list. So a couple things about this book. First of all, this book focuses on domestic abuse. So if that's anything that would be triggering for you, this is probably not going to be a book that you're going to want to pick up, because it is definitely relevant throughout the duration of the book. And second of all, what I'll tell you about the book will be very limited, because it would be very easy to get into spoiler territory with this, and I don't want to ruin anything for anyone that might want to end up picking this up. So this book follows our main character. Her name is Clove. She's in her mid to late 30s, and she has kind of what seems like on the surface a perfect life. She has money, she has a doting husband, and she has 2 beautiful children, and she's seemingly built this very idyllic life for herself. One day she gets a letter from some women's corrections facility in California, and all of a sudden she realizes that the facade that she has put up on her life being perfect is slowly starting to crumble, and she has all of these deep, dark secrets that she's keeping from her past that she now realizes are going to start to come to the surface based on the letter. And then the story kind of goes from there, and we learn all about what those secrets are, all of the things that happened to her in her past, who the letter is from, why that's important, and how she ended up ultimately in the situation that she is in her present day. So this book does kind of go back and forth between her past and her present. Now, as far as how much I enjoyed this book, anytime you're dealing with a book about a tough subject matter like this, it's hard to say that you enjoyed a book, but I thought that this was a solid read. I thought that it was decent. It started out really strong for me, and then it did start to fizzle and taper out a little bit toward the end. This being a mystery thriller, of course there are going to be plot twists and reveals along the way. Some of them were predictable, but I do think that the author honestly did a pretty good job of keeping a lot of it under wraps until very close to the reveal. So she did keep me on my toes for some of it. And I also, what I found interesting about this book, because it was a mystery suspense thriller type book, I always expect those books to be very fast-paced and propulsive, but this was actually a slower-paced book for me, and I think I appreciated that. It was not expected, but I felt like because the author really took her time painting the picture, giving us the details of everything that happened in the author or the narrator's life up to that point, it really painted that clear picture and allowed us to get, as the reader, all of the information. We compiled all of our research, we had everything we needed, and then we could make our final conclusion at the end. So I really did appreciate the pacing of this book, and it was not anything that I expected. And then the last thing that I will say is, this being a book that centers around domestic abuse, I always tend to think that those types of books are going to be very bleak and sad and depressing. But what I will say is, although there were very horrific elements in this book and there was a lot of, terrible things that happened to this character throughout her life, the author also balanced that with a lot of positivity and beautiful, healthy relationships. And I thought that that was very interesting, because so often when I'm reading a book that focuses on that particular subject, it does seem like the characters surround themselves with more toxic relationships. They tend to continue that cycle, and this took a different approach where instead of her going down that same path, she was able to find positive relationships, and she was able to get to a point where she did have positive people in her life, and she was being treated in a good way and a way that everybody should be treated. So I did appreciate that this just wasn't a doom and gloom type of book, that it actually did have a lot of hope in it as well. And also, I think that I would definitely read more from this author. I think she has 2 other books out already from her backlist, but yeah, it was an overall solid read. I think I gave it 3.5 stars, but yeah, I definitely think that I would pick up more from this author in the future. Moving on to What You Are Looking For Is in the Library. This is by Michiko Aoyama, translated from the Japanese by Allison Watts. And this is a cozy piece of fiction, and basically it just follows the lives of a group of people. It's set up in it's a novel, but there's interconnected short stories. And basically we're just following people that have kind of lost their way in life. There's some event happening or something in their lives that is causing them a lot of stress or causing them to question what their purpose is. And they all somehow end up at this specific community center that has this kind of mysterious and magical library, and there's a librarian there that points them to what they are physically looking for as far as the question that they're asking the librarian, but also she gives them an extra book, and it eventually leads them to truly what they're looking for in their life. And this is like I said, a feel-good book. It's that typical type of cozy Japanese read, it in tune of like Before the Coffee Gets Cold, and I'm trying to think of the last one that I read recently, but these are books that I read not necessarily to get a whole lot out of them. The message is typically very similar amongst them, but they're just those cozy reads that are an escape from all of the heavier things that I'm reading. This one didn't do anything special in particular, but I feel like if you're new to reading books like that, this would be a perfect one for you to start with. I'm always going to continue to pick up books like this because I find some level of comfort in them. But yeah, this was just, like I said, my run-of-the-mill type of cozy Japanese feel-good inspirational boost that I need. So something I haven't had a chance to talk about on my channel yet is the fact that they released the long list for the Republic of Consciousness Prize for the US and Canada recently. There are 10 books on that long list, and my next title is one of them. And that is Gifted by Suzumi Suzuki, and this is translated from the Japanese by Allison Markin Powell. And this was published by Transit in 2024. Now, this is a short book. It's just around 100 pages, and it follows themes of grief, death, abuse, intimacy, and it follows our main character, who is a sex worker in the Japanese red light district. So the main character, she is going through some stuff. She is a caretaker briefly at the beginning of the book for her mother, who is dying, and then very quickly or early on, her mother ends up in the hospital. So throughout the duration of the book, we're really following our main character as she is going to and from these visits to her mother, who is in hospital. And as the story unfolds, we're being told not only about the main character's life with her career and what it is that she does as a sex worker, but we're also learning about her mother's past through the voice of the author, and we're also learning about their relationship with each other. And unfortunately, it's a very sad relationship. There is a lot of abuse, and her mother was also a sex worker, so they have a lot of similarities in their life, but they also have a lot of really glaring differences as well. And not only is this main character dealing with the imminent death of her mother, but she also recently had a friend of hers take her own life. So she's dealing with grief in that aspect as well. So although all of those things that I just said made me want to read this book and pick it up because it sounded like something that I would really get along with, unfortunately, this book just didn't hit the mark for me. I thought that it had so much potential. Even as I started reading it, I found myself really intrigued by so many things, but the further I got into it, the more I realized that I just wasn't getting any of my questions answered. It felt random and all over the place, and although the author, through her writing, had absolute glimpses of genius, the very last page was absolutely beautiful, which made it all the more frustrating for me because it was so inconsistent throughout the rest of the book. She would have a line here that would absolutely blow me away, and then would go for pages and pages, and it sounded or felt to me like the diary of an angsty teenager that was mad at her mom. And I just found that to be so unfortunate because, like I said, it had so much potential. And I think what did this book a huge disservice for itself is the length. As I mentioned, this was a short book. It was just around 100 pages, but I feel like if the author explored all of the things that she was talking about a little more and gave this book a little more substance, I would have given this book 4 or 5 stars, because I feel like if she explored those things, I would have had a more clear understanding on the relationship between her and her mother and everything else that was going on. Instead, I felt like I just got really tiny fragments of everything. And perhaps that was the author's intention. Maybe we weren't supposed to get everything, but it just wasn't for me. Like, I needed more in order to say whether or not I enjoyed the story or appreciated it. And I just don't think that the author ever got us there. There were so many times when I was reading this book and something piqued my interest and I was like, yes, like, we're gonna learn more about this. We're gonna learn more about the abuse from her mother. And although we did get bits and pieces, it never closed the loop on anything. The same with the narrative about her friend and her friend taking her own life. Like, we never got enough to learn about what happened in that story. And like I said, it could have completely been the author's intention to keep us at a distance, but unfortunately, I was just looking for more and I was expecting more. However, I think after reading a little bit about this author, this is her first piece of fiction that has been published. So perhaps that's just because it was a debut. I know that she has the ability to write beautifully. Like I said, that last page, it blew me away how gorgeous the writing was. So I know she has that talent. So maybe this is just because it's a debut and she hasn't fully, fleshed out her craft. But I think that I will pick up more from her in the future, just because I do recognize that there is talent there, but unfortunately this one just didn't hit the mark for me. And the last book that I finished is Long Bright River by Liz Moore, and this was published in 2020. Now, this story takes place in Philadelphia and it follows primarily 2 sisters. We have Mickey, who is a police officer, and we have Casey, who is a heroin addict. And the story kind of starts to unfold when Mickey catches wind of some mysterious deaths that are happening, and they're occurring in an area where she knows that her sister frequents, and she is starting to get concerned because she doesn't want her sister to be the next victim. So she, as a police officer, is trying to get answers, but she kind of starts running into some dead ends, and she doesn't really think that anyone is taking this too seriously, so she decides to take things into her own hands and tries to figure out this mystery on her own. Not necessarily through the most ethical ways. So the story basically goes back and forth in time from present day to in the past, where we learn more about the sisters' relationship, their upbringing. We also learn about Mickey's life as a mother. She has a young son named Thomas. He is 4 years old, and she also has an old relationship with a man who was Thomas's or is Thomas's father. So we learn a lot about that as well. And I think that this was a really good book. I really enjoyed the first book I read by Liz Moore, which was God of the Woods, and that made me want to read this. And I honestly have to say, I think that she's really good at what she does. And I've talked about this already on this video about how sometimes with mystery thriller suspense books, it's really easy to get frustrated when there's a mystery and you as a reader figure it out right away because the writing just isn't very solid. But Liz Moore is able to give you the story. She gives it to you in bits and pieces, but it's not anything where the reveal is happening too early. You get enough to make assumptions, you get enough to make suspicions, and then partly you're right, but then there's another part of that twist. There's another level or tier, and it goes to that next level where you see something that you didn't see coming, which I really appreciate. I think that it's fun to predict some part of it, but to actually be surprised in the overall story is something that doesn't often happen with a lot of mysteries, and I had that experience with God of the Woods and also with Long Bright River. I think Liz Moore also did a really good job of painting that picture of the sister dynamic. So I mentioned that they had parents that were addicts, so you had that dynamic of one sister taking the path of following the lead of her parents, and then you have Mickey, who did the complete opposite. She did everything that she could to kind of get out of the way of letting that type of life destroy her, and it took her to the police force. But Mickey is also not a perfect character either. She still has flaws, and I loved that even though Mickey decided not to go down that path, she's still not a goody-goody either. She still has an edge to her, and she still has a grit to her. And I loved that the character was flawed, and part of the themes that really came out to me, and this was something that was called out multiple times, is that everybody is capable of a little good and a little bad. There's no person that completely epitomizes one or the other. Sometimes you're leaning more toward one way, but there's a dash of good in everyone that appears bad, and there's also a dash of bad in what appears to be a good person. And I really like the way that she explored that theme. I also really like her style of writing, the way that she lives in the present narrative, but she also takes us back into the past, and we're told the story in the time of the past, so we're reliving that. It's not the character reflecting in the present time of what happened in the past. She literally takes us back to that time, which I also appreciate. So yeah, I am glad that I read this one. I will say though, this is the same with God of the Woods as well. This book, Long Bright River, was almost 500 pages. I think the God of the Woods was maybe just over 500 pages. So she does a really good job, but her books are pretty chunky. But don't let that put you off if you're okay with a book being a little longer. I think that it's a book that paid off in the end, and it wasn't really a book that I was eager to be done with or thought that it should have been over too soon. I think that she did a really good job with pacing to keep me interested throughout the duration of the book, and everything that was included I felt was likely there for a purpose, and it didn't feel like it was a book that could have been edited down. I think that it was just the right size in order to get everything out of the story. So yeah, I think I'll have to double check to see if Liz Moore has any other backlist books, because I really do like her writing, and of course any new books that she has coming out in the future I will definitely be picking up. All right, so now that we've talked about what I finished, I always like to talk about what I'm actively reading. So let's get into that. So first and foremost, I think I want to talk about my project read of the year. Since this is my first recap, I haven't talked about what my big book of 2025 is going to be. I always like to try to pick a classic to do a slow read of throughout the duration of the year, and I may have alluded to this in one of my previous videos, but I wasn't quite sure on what I'd land on, but I did decide to go with War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, and Normally I start these big reads very close to the beginning of the year. I'll be honest and say I actually just started it this past week. And the reason that I was so delayed in starting it was I was really struggling to figure out exactly what translation I wanted to read. So in the past, my experience with Russian literature, I've only read two of the big ones, which is Anna Karenina and Crime and Punishment. And for both of those, I opted for the Richard Pavir and Larissa Volokhonsky translations. I really gelled well with both of those. I read Anna Karenina earlier in my life in a different translation, and I did not get along with it at all. And there's just something about the way that Pavir and Volokhonsky translate that I always tend to gravitate toward. However, I have a copy of the Pavir and Volokhonsky translation of War and Peace, but I was getting tripped up because if any of you are familiar with Russian literature, you'll know that there's also a French component to it as well for the most part. It was not uncommon for French to be spoken in Russia during the times when these major classics were being written, and it's incorporated into these texts as well. And I started the Pavir and Volokhonsky and I was enjoying it, but it had a lot of French and it had a lot of footnotes explaining the French, which normally I am okay with and I have no issue with, but I just came off of reading Les Mis last year, which was nothing but French being added into the narrative, and there were a ton of footnotes. And also I read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell at the end of last year as well, which has so many footnotes in it. And I will say that I'm kind of footnoted out. And I was really struggling with that translation. So I thought to myself, you know, I don't want to delay getting into the book. Let's see if I can find a different one. And I stumbled upon the Anthony Briggs translation, and there's French in here, but it's minimal. And I know that some purists would say I'm not reading the right translation because Tolstoy would have wanted all that French in there. But I think honestly, for my enjoyment level and my sanity, I can't deal with another book that has a ton of footnotes in it at the moment, so I did opt for this one. Another reason why I chose this one, which is actually really interesting, is that, let me see if I can find it real quick. They have a little appendix at the end. So obviously this is a big chunky book, but the most interesting part of this translation is at the very end there is I hope that this is focused, but there is actually a quick like one sentence summary of each of the chapters along the way. So I just love having that there. Now obviously this isn't going into super great detail of what is going on in the book, but it gives you just enough, because sometimes with these big books I try to read a chapter a day, but sometimes life gets away with me. I do travel for work, so I don't want to travel with this big old chunky book, so it might be like 5 or 6 days before I get back in here, and it's kind of nice to just get a quick little recap of the basics that happened. And I thought that that was really cool. This is the first time I've seen anything like that in one of these pieces of great Russian literature. So I thought that that was fun. And I also like the fact that this feels lighter than the Pavir and Volokhonsky version. I know that that doesn't sound like it would be too big of a deal for a book that's this chunky, but for some reason this feels way lighter. It is super floppy and it just opens completely, and all of those things combined, that is why I landed on this translation. It doesn't mean that I'm never going to read the Pavir and Volokhonsky version, but it's just what my heart is feeling right now, so I will continue with this one. And so far I'm not that far in, but just like with Anna Karenina, we've already been introduced to a ton of different characters. What I do appreciate about this one, and I don't know if it's just because of the translation, but I'm really not running into any issues yet with characters having multiple versions of the same name or the same character being called very different names. Everything seems to be pretty stable at the moment as far as that goes. And yeah, it's really readable, and from what little I've read of the story so far, I am very much enjoying it. All right, so the next book that I am reading is one that, I've been meaning to get to for so long, and I can already tell that this has potential to be one of my favorite reads if it keeps going as well as it is. This book is absolutely gorgeous, and that is Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. I know if you've read it, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. This book is very popular. I don't know why I've waited so long to read it, but I started this a couple days ago and I'm about 40 pages in, and this is some of the most beautiful writing I've ever had the privilege of reading. Maggie O'Farrell, she just has a way with words and with writing, and it is just a beautiful story so far. So for those of you that don't know, this is the story of Hamnet, who was a child of William Shakespeare. He had a twin sister. One day he was out trying to find somebody to come help his sister who had taken ill, and from what I understand, he falls ill himself and he eventually dies. That's not a spoiler. It's in the synopsis of the book on the back. But yeah, so far, the writing is just so lush and beautiful, and I cannot wait to dig deeper into this story. And then another book that I am reading, I have a lot of chunky books going on at the moment, and I don't have the dust jacket on this, but I am reading The Books of Jacob by Olga Tokarczuk, and this is translated from the Polish by Jennifer Croft. I'm actually reading this as part of the read-along that Jess over at Stalking Kafka is doing through Voxer, and we just finished the first book, so we're about 100, well, not quite 100, maybe 90 pages in. I'm really enjoying my time with it so far. Olga Tokarczuk is such a talented writer, and I think that she's really setting us up for an amazing book from what I have read so far. I'm getting along with the translation very well. And once again, this book is heavy. I don't know why it's so heavy. It's obviously a big book. It's over 900 pages, almost 1,000 pages, so obviously, but there's just something about the construction of this book that makes it feel so much heavier than it looks. So this is a book that I'll be, like I said, following along with the read along, so I'll probably travel with it sparsely because it is so heavy. But yeah, you'll probably not hear much more about this book until I finish it. But yeah, I wanted to let you know that it was kind of a little mini project that I'm working on. And then the other two books that I am working on, I am reading a book called The Possessed, and it's by Witold Gombrowicz, and this is translated from the Polish by Antonia Lloyd-Jones. And I'm reading this book as part of a special project, and it also ties back to another book that I actually finished reading in January that I didn't mention, but that is The Gathering by Anne Enright. So I finished this book, but I'm not not talking about it on this video because there's going to be a separate video talking about this one and this one. So this particular book is about a tennis coach that is hired to go to the Polish countryside to teach this young, or not teach, but to further coach this young female tennis player. And within the area of the house that she lives in, there's also this mysterious castle off in the distance, and it's basically said to be a gothic story. It's darkly funny, and there's like all of this weird and strange stuff that happens within this castle, and it's actually a book that I am struggling to put down. This was published in serialized form, so it is one of those books that has a lot of kind of mini cliffhangers throughout the duration of it, so I'm very much enjoying my time with this, but you're not going to hear much more about this book until I get that video project done, and you'll actually see probably within the next week or so. I filmed a video to talk about why I'm reading these two books specifically, along with another one, and that should be coming out soon. So more to come with that, just hold tight. And then the other thing that I just want to talk about as far as videos that are going to be coming out. So obviously we have my recap. I'm doing my project with The Possessed and The Gathering, but then I also have a video coming out with my TBR for Ben at Ben Reads Good, his read-along challenge. I can't remember if I mentioned this at the beginning of the video. If I did, I apologize for repeating myself, but I know it's toward the end of January and we're already 1 month down, but I did film a video. I just haven't had a chance to edit it yet, but I will get that out because I enjoyed my time so much with that readathon, or reading challenge. Yeah, reading challenge last year, that I wanted to participate again, and I absolutely love the prompts that Ben comes up with, so I wanted to share what I would be reading for that. So that's another video to come out soon. And yeah, a couple other things that are going to be not soon on the horizon, but in the little bit distant future. So we have the Republic of Consciousness Prize that I mentioned was released, that long list. I'm going to hopefully start to get to some of those books very shortly. And then the Women's Prize for Nonfiction is right around the corner. So I'm going to attempt to read as many books from that long list as possible. I don't think I'm going to read the whole long list. I'm going to find out what books have been long listed and read about them and kind of find out which ones really seem interesting to me. I won't put that pressure on myself like I did last year. I ended up in a bit of a reading slump because I was really trying to read the long list for both the Women's Prize for Fiction and Nonfiction, as well as the International Booker kind of at the same time, and I fell into a reading slump. So don't think I'll do that this year, but I'm definitely going to be reading some of them. So yeah, those are kind of the things that I have going on at the moment in my reading life. I'm so happy that you're here following me through all of this, and I love seeing your comments come through. One of the things that I was really bad at last year is responding to comments, and I will say that I've been really good so far this year about doing that. That is one of my goals this year, is to follow up with the comments. It is so easy for them to get away from you, and it sounds like a very simple thing to do, but when you have a lot going on in life and you're not really solely focused on your channel — I obviously do this as a hobby, and I work full-time, so it's tough to find those little pockets of time, but I am making an effort to do it because I feel like if you guys are taking the time out to comment, I should be responding to you and thanking you for your support for this channel. Anytime you like or subscribe or interact or comment, you know, that helps my channel grow, and I absolutely love this hobby. I get so much joy out of it, so I really appreciate all of the support that I get from each and every one of you. So thank you again, and yeah, here's to a really good reading year. I hope that all of you guys are reading really good books so far, and any reading goals that you created for yourself so far for this year, you're still on track with. And until we read again, bye.